At exactly 6 p.m., the state of Florida carried out a sentence that had been waiting nearly 4 decades. Inside Florida State Prison, the lights were bright, the room was silent, and the gurney stood ready. The man strapped to it was Frank Athen Walls. For 38 years, he had lived in a concrete cell, moving from appeal to appeal, watching governors change, laws shift, and technology evolve, knowing that one day the system would catch up to him. Outside the prison walls, families waited. Some for closure, some for answers, some for justice that had taken nearly a lifetime. But the story of how Florida arrived at that moment did not begin in a prison. It began decades earlier, with a quiet teenager, and a pattern of behavior that no one stopped in time. This is not just the story of an execution. This is the story of how a killer is built, step by step, and how warning signs were ignored until it was far too late. Frank Athen Walls was born on October 12, 1967 in Florida. Public records reveal very little about his early childhood. There are no widely known reports of extreme abuse, no confirmed accounts of violent trauma. And that is what makes this case unsettling, because sometimes the most dangerous individuals do not begin as visibly broken children. Sometimes they learn quietly. By his teenage years, Frank Walls was already showing behaviors that criminal psychologists recognize as precursors to violent escalation. He began with voyeurism, spying on women without their knowledge. Then break-ins, not to steal valuables, but to invade private spaces. Then animal abuse, a behavior consistently linked to future violent offenders. These were not random acts, they were rehearsals. Each act tested boundaries. Each act lowered resistance. Each act fed something inside him that required more. By the time he reached adulthood, Walls was no longer experimenting. He was preparing. In the mid-1980s, Frank Walls appeared ordinary on the surface. He worked as a dishwasher at a restaurant called Quincy's. Low wages, no ambition, no visible future. He lived in a trailer with roommates who quickly noticed something was wrong. One of them, Thomas Animal Farnham, later told investigators that living with Walls made him deeply uneasy. Walls spoke openly about rape, murder, and ways to kill without being caught. Not as jokes, not hypothetically, but as topics of fascination. Farnham said Walls would describe violent scenarios casually, as if discussing a movie or a plan. This is a critical moment in the story, because this is where intervention could have happened, and it didn't. Criminal profilers later identified Walls as someone driven by power and control, not impulse alone. He did not kill in a rage. He killed to dominate. Before his first murder, Walls had already crossed multiple psychological thresholds. He had invaded private spaces. He had objectified victims. He had rehearsed violence mentally. By 1985, the transition from fantasy to reality was no longer a question of if, only when. On March 26, 1985, Frank Walls was 17 years old. He was performing community service on Okaloosa Island. It was a quiet Tuesday. The beach was calm. That's when he saw Tommy Lou Whitten, a 19-year-old junior college student, lying on the sand, sunbathing. She was relaxed, unaware, completely defenseless. Walls approached her holding a knife. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He did not speak. He cut her throat in a single motion. As blood soaked into the white sand, Walls walked away. No panic, no hesitation. He stole her car and disappeared. Tommy Lou Whitten's body was discovered later that afternoon. Her car was found the next day, Abandoned, discarded, stripped of meaning. For law enforcement, it appeared to be a tragic but isolated act. For Frank Walls, it was a beginning. The first murder is often the most instructive. Walls learned that he could kill quickly, he could escape, he could take a life and continue living. There were no immediate consequences, and that absence of consequence is one of the most dangerous reinforcements known to criminal psychology. Walls didn't stop. He waited, and he evolved. 18 months would pass before Frank Walls struck again. But when he did, the violence would no longer be quick. It would be personal, it would be brutal, and it would reveal how far he had already descended. We will examine the murders that exposed his growing rage, and the moment when killing stopped being enough. If you want to understand how this story unfolds, from escalation to capture to execution, stay with us, because the road to death row is never straight, and this one was soaked in warning signs. By the spring of 1985, Frank Athen Walls had crossed a line few ever return from. He had taken a life, and nothing happened to him. No arrest, no public suspect, no consequences. For many killers, that moment, when murder goes unpunished, is not a warning. It is permission. 18 months passed after the murder of Tommy Lou Whitten. To the outside world, it may have looked like Walls had stopped, but investigators later understood something far more dangerous was happening. He was learning. Walls continued working menial jobs. He continued living among others. He continued blending into everyday life. But inside his mind, violence was evolving. Criminal psychologists describe this phase as fantasy refinement, a period where an offender replays the first crime repeatedly, imagining how it could have been done differently, more violently, more completely. Walls wasn't satisfied anymore with speed. He wanted control. On September 16, 1986, in Wright, Florida, Walls struck again. This time, the victim was Cynthia Sue Condra, a 24-year-old woman. There was no beach, no anonymity of distance, no quick escape. What happened next was a dramatic escalation. Walls stabbed Cynthia 21 times. This was not about killing. This was about rage, dominance, and dehumanization. Each wound told a story. Repeated force, loss of restraint, complete disregard for suffering. He left her body in plain view, discarded along the roadside. This was not a mistake. This was confidence. In forensic psychology, overkill, far beyond what is necessary to cause death, signals emotional escalation. Walls was no longer simply eliminating a victim. He was expressing something internal. Anger he could not articulate. Control he could not feel elsewhere, and need to dominate completely. And once again, he got away. 2 murders, 2 different locations. No arrest. Law enforcement had no suspect connecting the cases. Walls learned a second lesson. He could escalate and still remain invisible. This realization is critical, because killers who believe they are untouchable do not slow down. They expand. In the early morning hours of May 20th, 1987, near Fort Walton Beach, Walls committed one of his most revealing crimes. His victim was Audrey Gaji, a 47-year-old factory worker. She had no connection to him, no shared history, no reason to be targeted, except that she was alone. Walls broke into her mobile home. This was not spontaneous. Breaking into an occupied home marks another escalation. Higher risk, greater thrill, greater sense of power. Walls raped Audrey. Then he left. But as he moved away from the scene, something changed. For the first time, Doubt entered his mind. Walls realized he had made what he considered a mistake. He had left a live-in witness. In his twisted logic, that meant exposure. So he went back. Returning to a crime scene is rare and incredibly dangerous for offenders. But Walls wasn't thinking about risk. He was thinking about control. He stabbed Audrey to death. Then he stole items of little value, a fan, a radio, objects that meant nothing materially but mattered psychologically. They were trophies. Walls believed he had erased the threat. But he had left behind something far more permanent, a fingerprint. At the time, it meant nothing. But decades later, it would speak louder than he ever could. By 1987, Frank Walls had transformed, from public spaces to private homes, from quick killing to prolonged violence, from anonymity to intimate terror. But his most dangerous evolution was still ahead, because his next crime would involve something new: witnesses. Just 2 months later, Walls crossed into his most violent chapter. At 1:30 a.m. in Greenwood Mobile Home Park, he broke into the home of Edward Alger, a 22-year-old U.S. Air Force Airman, Ann Louise Peterson, his 20-year-old girlfriend. This was not burglary. This was a planned execution. Walls made noise deliberately. He wanted them awake. He wanted fear. Armed with a .22 caliber handgun and a knife, Walls forced Ann to bind Edward herself. This act alone reveals profound psychological cruelty. He wasn't just restraining victims. He was destroying trust, weaponizing love, and asserting godlike authority. And then, something unexpected happened. Edward fought back. Edward Alger managed to loosen his restraints. In a moment of desperate courage, he attacked Walls. For a split second, the outcome was uncertain. Walls slashed Edward's throat, but Edward didn't stop. He bit Walls' hand, hard enough to make him drop the knife. It was an act of defiance. And Walls responded with execution. 3 gunshots to the head. Edward Alger died on the floor of his own home. Walls returned to Ann. He assaulted her as she begged for her life. He shot her once. She survived, so he covered her face with a pillow and shot her again. This time, he made sure. Walls stole a small amount of money and another fan. Then he left. But this time, the pattern broke, because Walls had left behind something he couldn't erase. Suspicion. Within 24 hours, Frank Walls would be identified. Within days, his life would change forever. But the evidence waiting inside his trailer would reveal something far darker than even police expected. We will examine the arrest, the physical evidence, and the mistake that guaranteed he would never walk free again. Stay with this story, because once the mask came off, Florida realized what had been living among them. Serial killers survive on one illusion: that they are invisible. On July 22nd, 1987, Frank Athen Walls believed he had committed his most controlled crime yet. Instead, he committed his last. Because this time, people were watching. In the early hours after the murders of Edward Alger and Ann Louise Peterson, residents of Greenwood Mobile Home Park began talking. Someone had seen a man walking away in the dark. Someone else noticed a trailer door open unusually late. Another neighbor recalled a man with scratches on his hands. Individually, these details meant little. Together, they formed a direction. Police canvassed the area. One trailer kept coming up: Frank Walls. When investigators knocked on Walls' door, he didn't panic. He didn't flee. He didn't lawyer up immediately. Instead, he talked. Walls claimed he had been home all night, said he heard nothing, saw nothing, But officers noticed something troubling: fresh wounds, cuts on his hands. When asked about them, Walls hesitated. Then he blamed work. It was a small crack. But cracks are how structures fail. Police returned with a warrant. Inside Walls' trailer, they found what killers always underestimate: patterns. A .22 caliber handgun, blood-stained clothing items that did not belong to him, fans matching those stolen from victims' homes. Then they found something far worse: a knife with traces of blood. Walls was taken into custody, but the most damning evidence hadn't been discovered yet. During the struggle with Edward Alger, Walls had been bitten. Hard? At the time, bite mark evidence was still widely accepted in court. Investigators photographed Walls' wound. They compared it to Edward's dental impressions. The match was devastating. Walls' body had testified against him. Under questioning, Walls tried to control the narrative. He admitted being near the scene, then admitted entering the home, then admitted violence. But his version shifted constantly. He blamed victims. He minimized his actions. He showed no visible remorse. Psychologists later noted something chilling. Walls didn't see his victims as people. He saw them as mistakes, problems, objects. And once the dam broke, investigators pushed further. Detectives revisited unsolved murders. One fingerprint, long ignored, was run again. It matched. Walls was connected to Cynthia Sue Condra, Audrey Gaji, Tommy Lou Whitten. 3 murders. 1 escalation. 1 man. What Florida believed were isolated tragedies were a single unfolding nightmare. In 1988, Frank Walls stood trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Physical evidence, fingerprints. Bite marks, witness testimony. His own shifting statements, the jury did not deliberate long. Walls was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder. The sentence? Death. Walls was sent to Florida's death row. There, he attempted something many condemned killers try: rewriting history. He filed appeals, claimed unfair treatment, challenged evidence standards. Years passed, decades. Families waited. Victims were remembered. Walls aged. Frank Walls was executed by electrocution at Florida State Prison. He was 34 years old. His final moments were quiet. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the lives he destroyed. Just silence. Frank Walls didn't just kill people. He shattered families, changed communities, left scars that never fully healed. But his story holds a warning. Evil rarely announces itself. It blends in, it waits, it escalates, until someone notices. Every crime scene had clues. Every escalation had meaning. But patterns are only powerful if they are recognized. Frank Walls survived as long as he did because his violence was treated as isolated. It never was. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you how fragile normalcy can be, then stay aware. And if you want more true crime stories told with depth, context, and respect for the victims, subscribe, because remembering them is the least we can do.